One of my favorite songs recently has been Everybody Supports Women by Sophia Isela. Apart from the exquisite writing, which isn't a surprise, Sophia is marvelous, what I love about it is the way it highlights the pitting of women against each other, not just by men, but by other women. In a world where women are encouraged to be supportive of each other or be girls, in other words, someone who values female friendships, especially more than male relationships, you would think there was nothing but progress in our community. But oftentimes than not, I've realized there's this strange competition amongst women that few choose to discuss. The first lyrics in the song I mentioned earlier say, "Everybody supports women until a woman's doing better than you." Over the years, research has shown women admitting that their biggest nightmares at work are not men, but other women. Some men have admitted to being confused by women in workplaces, smiling at each other one minute while simultaneously gossiping, sabotaging, and stabbing each other in the back. Women are intelligent beings, and unfortunately that level of intelligence can be dangerous when wired to manipulate, scheme, plot against, or hurt other people. Research also shows that a lot of this behavior stems from insecurity. Chances are the cattiness, the rude remarks, and the name-calling sometimes is just nothing more than projection. Experts have also added that this competition amongst women, at least in the workplace, is due to limited spaces for women in the workforce, giving the idea that if they want to accomplish more or reach higher status, the only way to achieve that is to step on other women to get there. This isn't to say that men do not do this to each other. They do, a lot of the times. But the reason why I talk about this is because young girls in our society are being taught that the man is their biggest threat to success and happiness, especially in the workplace due to sexism, not other women, to the point where they are unprepared on how to deal with reality when it smacks them across the face. Also because it's relevant to this topic. It's also interesting that competitiveness in women has always been portrayed as a nasty trait compared to men, where it is viewed as an attractive quality. Men can compete for positions at work, social status, money, prizes, and even women, and will be hailed for being quote-unquote manly. But the second women compete, suddenly it's catty, immature, and nasty. I believe this is why competition against women, instead of going away, has just become more secretive, manipulative, and ruthless, especially now that the popular thing is to be a girl's girl. This is why it's hardly shocking when a celebrity whose brand is big on supporting other women gets exposed for being a secret mean girl. In my mother tongue, we have an old saying that goes, "Mandriam gadzim gads." In other words, a woman's greatest adversary is often another woman. Again, for house cleaning purposes, this isn't to claim that women cannot be supportive with each other. My mother, my sister, and my best friends are my biggest supporters and cheerleaders. What I'm trying to do here is highlight that when a natural part of a human being is suppressed in order to fit a societal norm, in this case, competitiveness in women, it tends to come out in the ugliest ways possible. Our ancestors didn't need research to know that, just good observation skills. Which, by the way, I've used those to notice something interesting about K-pop. Some of the biggest haters of female idols in our stan universe is actually female K-pop stans. I'll admit I've tried tracking this topic before and I didn't exactly do a satisfactory job. My main focus in that video was the constant attack on female idols who fit the beauty standard in South Korea and how their existence tends to bring out the ugliness within the K-pop fanbase, where they're harassed to sometimes almost unbelievable levels. But there are certain parts of the discussion I left untouched that I believe needed to be added to give a more nuanced view of the topic. One thing I should have done, and I'm doing now before going any further, is making a distinction on the types of toxic female K-pop stans, because despite toxicity being their similar trait, they tend to express it in different ways and to some degree for different reasons. From my observation, I would say there are two main types of toxic female K-pop stans, the pick-me and the performative feminist. These two go hand in hand to some degree because their intense hatred for hyperfeminine idols stems from the assumption that their traits are manufactured to gain the attention of the male gender. What separates them, however, is that the pick-me's hatred is fueled by her craving of the attention hyperfeminine idols receive from these male idols in general. Whereas to the performative feminist believes that hyperfeminine idols are to blame for the regression of the women's movement by quote-unquote trying to please men. The pick-me fan tends to make defending male idols her entire personality trait, and her hypocrisy shows by bashing female idols for making the same mistakes that male idols make. She has a list of excuses as to why the male idol didn't know any better, or couldn't sing live, or why his past mistakes aren't that bad, or his bad choices are not up for discussion. But the second female idol commits a fraction of those crimes, she reserves the right to call her every name in the book, and no amount of explanations can justify those mistakes. She may also make a habit of constantly expressing her dislike for girl groups, especially those with feminine concepts, because she's just not into girly things, using that as an excuse to make nasty comments about them and their concepts. Any and all mannerisms by these feminine idols, the pick-me overanalyzes them to be some tactics to attract male idols or men in general, using these idols as human shields, projecting her own want for that male validation. It's entirely possible for girls to not be into girly things, cute concepts, or to prefer more intense concepts from girl groups in general. The difference between them and the pick-me is that they do not waste their time harassing those who are interested in these concepts. In fact, a number of them, tomboys especially, know what it's like to be made fun of or bullied for liking quote-unquote boy stuff. Because of that, they are sensitive enough to not always judge people's personalities and intentions based on their music taste. As for the performative feminist, she believes that her proof of support of the women's movement lies in the fact that she stands girl groups solely. She mainly expresses her loyalty by harassing male idols for simply breathing in the same space as female idols. In her mind, she is the savior of all female idols and always assumes that any male idols in their fave's proximity is some sort of predator. At times, she may present a mindset that her idol quote-unquote hates men as a joke to prove her point. Oftentimes not, if you dig deep enough, you find that she has a habit of harassing male idols in general. In her eyes, every mistake a male idol makes is fueled by misogyny, and brands any and all male idols sexist whenever the argument fits her narrative. In her mind, everything wrong with K-pop is entirely to be blamed on male idols, so much so that women can do no wrong in her eyes. Min Hee-jin may not be a K-pop idol, but she's a great example of this. It has become clear that so many defended her off the simple basis that she is a woman, even if it has been proven numerous times that she's painfully problematic at best. Unlike the pick-me fan who comes up with several excuses for male idols and their bad choices, the performative feminist has several versions of the same excuse, and that excuse is always somehow, in some way, a male idol's fault. The main way she expresses her hatred for male idols, apart from the constant harassment of them, is the lengths she goes to attack hyper-feminine idols for their femininity. As far as she's concerned, all feminine idols are the way that they are because they are fake. The idea of women simply being hyper-feminine because it's part of their personality trait is a foreign concept to her. This is shown in the incapability to praise non-hyper-feminine idols without pulling down hyper-feminine ones, accusing them of being immature little girls in comparison to quote-unquote real women. Hyper-femininity to her is just a reason to gain attention from men, and to her, that behavior furthers the patriarchy and sets women back from all the progress they have made thus far. Any criticisms of these quote-unquote real women in K-pop from other female stans apparently stems from some form of internalized misogyny, and no other reason whatsoever. Not too long ago, I experienced a similar accusation, claiming I was ungrateful for what the feminist movement had done for me as a woman due to my expression of distaste for Wasa's behavior on her performance at a university. This type of thinking stems from the idea that, ironically, most toxic men hold, which is that feminism is about being against men in general. The two sides of the toxic female stance, despite their different philosophies, meet in the middle when they harass hyper-feminine, or, if we should be frank, strongly desired female idols within the industry, because they've led themselves to believe that they are the bottom line problem. To the pick-me, deep down inside, these female idols are a harsh reminder of everything the male idols they adore are attracted to, and the stinging reality that they are not the object of that affection. And to the performative feminists, they find it easier to pick on them rather than admit that these idols' confidence in displaying their hyper-feminine traits and being desired for it triggers their darkest insecurities. There is a third type of toxic female stan, but I'll address that later. The hatred of femininity is a concept old as time, and for generations, women with hyper-feminine characteristics have been criticized by other women for being a preference for most masculine men. Hyperfeminine traits such as being soft, nurturing, passive, and graceful have been viewed as synonymous with being attractive in women, just as typical masculine traits such as taking charge, leadership, aggression, and social dominance were viewed as attractive in men. If we're being realistic though, every person, regardless of gender, possesses both sides. They just tend to lean more on one than the other depending on things like personality or given situations around them. Human beings are just not one-dimensional. But for centuries, showing traits viewed as those opposite to one's gender were often labeled as either unmanly or unladylike. For instance, men showing emotional vulnerability or women asserting dominance in a situation. Fear-mongering statements such as, "be a real man," or "no one will marry you," are often used to discourage this behavior. In my personal experience growing up in the church, these fear-mongering tactics were often emphasized for the youth especially. So imagine my confusion when I read about David and his army weeping out loud until they were out of strength after the Amalekites burned down their town and kidnapped their families, or when the prophetess Deborah often went into battles with the armies of ancient Israel, even prophesying at one point that God would deliver Caesarea in the hands of a woman, which he did. This made me grow up with a little bit of an inner conflict about these traditional roles, as probably most kids in my generation did. As part of the fight against the patriarchy, most women have expressed their exhaustion with being expected to behave a certain way because that is quote-unquote what a woman is supposed to do. So it is not surprising that some have grown to resent or even hate feminine characteristics and somehow associate them with the very patriarchy they are trying to eliminate. As a result of this resentment, some of the generations of women that have come after them have been raised with the same level of resentment, even going as far as believing that leaning more into their masculine traits is what actually defies the patriarchy and what makes real or quote-unquote authentic women, and that any otherwise behavior is just an effort to attract men. Soon some people manufactured the movement from giving women the right to make choices about their lives, bodies, and careers to more of putting expectations on women to ditch traditionally feminine characteristics altogether to prove that they support feminism, ironically exhibiting the traits of the very ideology they protest against in the first place. In our generation, the feminine woman has gone from being resented for being desirable to the male agenda to being despised for allegedly not supporting the movement that was designed to free her. K-pop becoming more popular outside of South Korea opened the country up to a lot of judgment on its mainly conservative social views in comparison to their now liberal audience. One of the main giveaways that led to the culture shock most K-pop stans felt entering into that space was the country's overt hatred for feminism in general. And no, not the extreme or performative parts of the movement. The hatred of basic ideologies of feminism. It seems to a noticeable degree, South Korea as a nation still struggles with the idea that women deserve the same basic rights as men. Most of their men, young ones especially, hold a general view that feminism exists to control men and manipulate them into becoming less of who they truly are, and this painfully reflects in almost all areas of their lives. From their basic nucleus family units to their workspaces, their government, and even their judiciary system. The country still has one of the widest gender wage gaps amongst OECD nations. Sexual crimes committed against women and young girls are often punished by slaps on the wrist. And general views on women are painfully backward and almost impossible to imagine coming from a nation so advanced in other areas. To paint a clear picture of this, as of late, more and more Korean men in their 20s and 30s have joined pro-President Yoon Suk-yeol protests, the same president who declared martial law almost out of nowhere last year. Plenty of experts believe the reason for this support comes from the distrust these young men carry for the Democratic Party that vowed to handle gender inequality issues in 2022, and lost popularity because of it, by the way. A lot of young men believe any sort of progress for women in the country will lead to a reverse discrimination of men, and they are not shy about vocalizing that notion, using it to fearmonger other young men into seeing things the same way. Other experts also believe that the support for this president has grown exponentially in the last few weeks, maybe coming out boldly simply because many women tend to support his impeachment. Looking at how the nation tends to see women, you can see why K-pop stans, especially ones raised with more progressive views on womanhood, would be judgmental of the country's social views and their men. Analyzing it from the way locals support K-pop groups, it's almost obvious to the new K-pop fan how highly praised hyperfeminine idols are in this industry. Groups such as Twice and G-Friend, whose concepts were predominantly feminine and whimsical, had huge percentages of male fans, including some much older than the members. It's also quite obvious that female idols who are conventionally attractive have been manufactured to have online personas with feminine characteristics to make them more loved by the domestic fans. And oftentimes, they tend to have the most fans compared to the rest of their respective groups. What didn't help is that these idols seemed to have plenty of preferential treatment from their respective companies, especially when it came to wardrobe and public promotion. This often left less hyperfeminine idols, who international fans tended to gravitate towards, by the way, at a sizable disadvantage, which didn't go unnoticed. Natural resentment for these idols was brewing little by little, and the nation's often loud hatred of feminism was simply adding oil to the fire. Soon, complaints from the international market began to rise against this clear unfairness, making the hatred of these feminine idols almost inevitable. Soon, hyperfeminine idols became massive targets of never-ending hate trains, over-the-top public scrutiny, and ridiculous double standards. I've spoken on the term pick-me before, and how it's misused in K-pop, so I'm not going to get into too many details about that or where the term came from. I'll simply link the video that discusses it at the top right corner of your screen. But keeping it short, a pick-me by definition is a woman who's willing to do anything for male attention, especially throwing other women under the bus. The most obvious characteristic of a pick-me is their constant and unrelenting criticism of other women, mainly on how they interact with men, whether it is in or out of relationships, while putting themselves on pedestals, preaching on the many things they can do better than quote-unquote women nowadays. Pick-me's often make an effort to get a man's attention in any way possible, so that these men could choose or pick them, so to speak. As mentioned earlier, hyperfeminine traits nowadays are associated with trying to attract male attention. This has become such an issue in K-pop that almost any interactions between male and female idols feel like a minefield. Any mannerisms by these female idols are often overanalyzed, and the conclusion as to why they behave that way is always attributed to seeking male validation and attention, hence why they feel entitled to use the label "pick me" on these idols. Yuna is one of the biggest victims of this title. A couple of years ago, she was literally harassed for blessing herself when she sneezed during a V-Live. Months before that, the girl was accused of pretending to be afraid of confetti sounds just to, quote-unquote, get the attention of ENHYPEN Sunghoon. Soon, every time Yuna so much as looked at a male idol, it became the norm to assume that she was trying to gain their attention, and all these idols' female fans would harass her for it. Videos with hundreds of thousands and at times millions of views circled the internet, making over-the-top observations in her interactions with these male idols and accusing her of crushing on them and trying to gain their attention. Once it was a popular notion that Yuna was a male attention seeker, suddenly every feminine mannerism she expressed was met with insane hate, even in the absence of these male idols. Wonyoung also faced such scrutiny, especially during her time as the music bank co-host with Sunghoon. Trust engines to always be at the scene of the crime. First, it was the harassment over her high-pitched MC voice being quote-unquote fake so that Sunghoon would find her cute. Then it was whenever Sunghoon helped her with anything, being attacked for allegedly pretending to be helpless in order to gain his attention. It got so bad that at one point Sunghoon wouldn't even lift a finger to help her open a bag of chips out of fear of the harassment she'd faced. While Wonyoung's hate train has more layers to it than just hyperfemininity, it played a massive role in its furtherance. The comparisons to her group member Gayeol were a dead giveaway, especially after Strawberry Gate. Yeri, who I'd like to add is known for being friends with so many idols, was strongly attacked for posting a picture with a caption that used the same emojis as Jungkook's previous caption. I repeat, she was harassed for using the same emojis that Jungkook had used. Emojis, people. His so-called fans brutally attacked her, calling her names that I refuse to repeat here. While Yeri isn't known to be a hyper-feminine idol, it's very telling that her closeness to some of these male idols in the industry is seen as a massive threat to those of toxic female stans. All three of these idols were accused of being quote-unquote pick-me's, and that is a label that has stuck to them over the course of their careers recently. What female K-pop stans who push these hate trends against these hyper-feminine idols tend not to realize is that the actions they are exhibiting are those of actual pick-me's themselves. The pick-me fan deludes herself into thinking that she is looking out for the male idols in these interactions. Her real intentions, however, are exposed in the way she puts so much effort into emphasizing how little romantic interest her fave has in these female idols. Almost as if she's trying to convince herself of that idea. What she will not admit is that her actions are deeply driven by jealousy. Jealousy that she will never have the male idols she coverts for. Nor will she ever get their attention and adoration the same way these hyper-feminine idols tend to do. Enough is not said about how devastatingly lonely too many of these toxic pick-me stans are, and how undesirable they feel due to either bullying in their real lives or feeling like social outcasts. K-pop is often used by them as an unhealthy form of escapism to cope with these issues. Some of them medicate that feeling of undesirability by creating a world in their imaginations where they are desirable in the eyes of their favorite male idols, who, by the way, are in a market that thrives on parasocial relationships. This industry carefully carves their idols to present themselves as romantically available to their fan bases, and the pick-me fan becomes an easy victim of this marketing tactic. Hyperfeminine idols, especially those adored by the male demographic, shatter this bubble that the pick-me fan lives in by simply existing. It becomes painfully aware that the male idols the pick-me stan worship have preferences. Preferences that do not include some miserable, jobless, lonely fan living halfway across the world with no hopes of ever competing with the many beauty standards these female idols tend to possess. And they hate them for it. As some say, jealousy is one hell of a drug, and if you observe carefully, these pick-me stans always tell on themselves in the fact that they're always assuming that these hyper-feminine actions are only done to attract male idols. On the other hand, the other section of female toxic stans who push this stereotype on hyperfeminine idols and women in general, despite claiming to be all for supporting women, do not realize that they're turning themselves into part of the problem. This isn't to brush off the important reality of what I've discussed earlier, surrounding the use of hyperfemininity in K-pop to attract male audiences in the local market. That is a necessary part of a nuanced discussion. It does not, however, take away the toxicity this type of fan exhibits by making it her mission to degrade the womanhood of such idols because it does not fit her misguided versions of what feminism is about. She reduces hyperfeminine idols to being nothing but little girls who don't understand what it means to be quote-unquote real women. Her jealousy of these idols comes from a different angle, though. The angle of a generation that was raised watching popular media villainize hyperfemininity. Such characters, especially in movies and TV shows, were constantly portrayed as mean girls and bullies, spoiled rotten kids who never had to work for anything a day in their lives, depending on their rich families to get whatever they wanted whenever they wanted it. The ordinary looking characters with nothing special about them are presented as the main characters who suffer at the hands of these bullies, having to overcome them by winning the affections of the guy the hyperfeminine character is always obsessed with. Hyperfemininity has long been villainized in media that too many people, girls especially, have come to associate its characteristics with spoiled and privileged behavior. So when these fans, having been fed this mental toxic diet, see hyperfeminine idols get preferential treatment in either stage outfits or promotions, that resentment naturally comes out, not seeing these choices as purely business decisions. Again, like pygmies, what they'll never admit to themselves is that, as much as they resent these idols, they themselves so badly wish to live in a world where they can receive that sort of preferential treatment. That is why at the end of the movie, the ordinary character getting the boy is always so satisfying these popular chick flick movies. They want to know that they can get the pretty privileged treatment without the pretty part for themselves. The jealousy roots from thinking that hyperfeminine idols have it easy due to their looks in comparison to those who have to quote-unquote work hard to gain a fraction of their attention. For a supporter of a movement that doesn't view womanhood as one-dimensional, this toxic feminist fan does a great job of excluding the hyperfeminine aspects of it and disregarding it as not real womanhood. This is another similarity between these two sections of toxic female stans. They push harmful stereotypes on these idols out of pure jealousy for the simple reason that they want what they have. Another similarity between these toxic female stan types is the not-so-subtle expression of hyperfeminine idol hatred through token-standing idols with opposite personas. Yeah, we should talk about that. These idols oftentimes, if not all, are the least biased members of their respective groups, they have a distinct talent worth noting, and they aren't exactly highlighted by the company, especially in the group's songs and stage performances. One such idol, I've already briefly talked about earlier, is Gail of IVE. It doesn't take a genius dive to know that too many of her fans are performative and only exist to compare her to Wonyoung. One of the most obvious ways to support this performative female stand is their strong presence in a hate train and nowhere else. During Wonyoung's Strawberry Gate scandal, Gaio stands were popping out of nowhere, praising her for being quote-unquote real and authentic, literally based on her eating habits alone. Videos comparing Gaio to Wonyoung received millions of views and tens of thousands of comments in Gaio's praise. Yet those so-called supporters are nowhere to be seen in her fancam views or promotional photos, making it painfully obvious that this was about hating Wonyoung, not supporting idols who quote-unquote deserve better from their companies. Another perfect example of this is Liz, when these performative stans bashed Yiso for her Lee Moo-jin service appearance, complaining that Liz deserved that opportunity, completely unaware that she had already appeared on the program a year earlier. These stans will even go as far as to start a hate train using these idols they token stan just to harass feminine idols. And once again, Wonyoung has experienced this, when the stans tried to claim that she was attention-seeking and fighting with Gaio for the center spot on their standing arrangements, completely ignoring the fact that Wonyoung ought to stand in the center because she's the group center. Behaviors such as these prove that toxic female stans are behind the hate, as they strongly believe that feminine idols are the way that they are to seek attention. The comment sections are often filled with backhanded compliments towards Gail, praising her for being quote-unquote selfless and respectful unlike Wonyoung. In fact, most compliments about her hardly focus on her individuality or skill ability, but rather everything she does in opposite to Wonyoung, like apparently never needing to be highlighted by a company to shine, or never needing the best outfits to stand out in comebacks, or how she's never needed looks to showcase herself as her talent does all the speaking. It is clear that Wonyoung is being slighted in these comments, just like all girly groups tend to be slighted when groups such as Kiss of Life get praised for being quote-unquote real women. What increases the frustration in these situations is that oftentimes or not, the real stans of these token stand idols do not call out this behavior because they secretly tend to resent the hyperfeminine member who receives all the attention. Yes, at times the actual fans of the idol will be passive in the presence of the hate trains, if not straight up encourage the token standing out of desperation for their fave to gain popularity from it. They may not hate hyperfeminine idols for being hyperfeminine. They do resent that the members that they stan, whom they probably view as more talented, are not getting the same levels of attention. So out of pure spite, they'll support this toxic behavior for their personal benefit. That's another interesting subset of toxic female stans that's not talked about enough. Those that deal with their inner insecurities by over-identifying with an idol they assume has similar insecurities. For instance, fans who are unpopular in real life and wish that for themselves will support the least popular member of the group, or plus-size fans will stand an idol who gets bullied by netizens for their weight, simply for that reason. What differentiates them from the toxic standing by other subsets is that instead of leaving when it no longer suits the agenda, they become die-hard fans for this particular idol because they are quote-unquote so relatable. In real life, these fans have a chip on their shoulder. They've convinced themselves that the reason why they are not popular or liked is because of someone else, and that someone else is usually the popular or the well-loved person in their social circles. They operate on the scarcity mindset. If someone has it, that means there isn't enough for anyone else. They translate this idea into their standing experience, resenting the popular hyper-feminine member for being popular and being the opposite of whatever insecurities they have, whether it's a lack of confidence or a visual part of their body. They reduce the contribution in their respective groups to being nothing but their looks, just to feel better about themselves, and often soothe their egos by claiming that they have so much more to offer than these hyper-feminine idols, pedestaling themselves as people of substance. That's why they're so passive when these idols face harassment. They believe in some weird, twisted way it is vindication for their own personal insecurities, and feel some sick sense of satisfaction by it. It doesn't matter to them what the haters' agenda is, just that they hate on these idols, and if they use their faves to do it, even better. They are part of the problem because they are supporting the agendas of these pygmies and toxic feminist stands, and the less they are called out, the bolder their hatred is. It's so easy for these hate trends by toxic female stands to spread because other female stands see this behavior for what it is, but stand by and watch it happen because they emotionally benefit from it. It is a cycle that perpetuates negativity and undermines the true spirit of a fandom, which should be about support, appreciation, and spaces where idols are to be valued for their unique contributions in the industry, not to be viewed as subhumans based on their preferences. While fandom culture is not inherently bad, it is divisions such as the ones I've covered in this video that make the experience an exasperating one at times. It should not come as a surprise though, considering that the industry is fashioned to prey on the insecurities of an impressionable audience in exchange for their emotional investment. This is what all this toxicity boils down to at the end of the day. Personal insecurities being projected onto idols. No matter what section of female toxic stands you break down, the root of their behavior is always insecurity. Whether in their looks, bodies, or social status, the sense of satisfaction they receive from making someone who has what they lack is the driving force of their actions. And you know what makes it sad? How temporary that satisfaction is. Once they come down from that emotional high, they have to repeat their actions over and over and over again to get back to that feeling. It's like a drug addiction. The more you feed it, the hungrier it gets. It's a futile attempt to fill the bottomless pit inside one's soul. The best way to end this addiction is to starve it. But like all addictions, when starved, the withdrawal symptoms are severe. And for these toxic female stands, the withdrawal symptoms are taking accountability and responsibility. Believe you me, they can't handle that.